All right, let's dive into your revision for what can be a seriously tough A-level topic, 20th century religious language. I know this one can be a bit of a headache, but we're going to cut right through all the confusing stuff, get to the core ideas, and make sure you feel totally ready for that exam.
So, let's just jump right to the heart of it. In the 20th century, a bunch of philosophers asked a pretty radical question. When we talk about God, when we say things like, God is good, or God exists, are we actually saying anything with meaning, or is it all just, well, noise? This is the big puzzle we need to get our heads around.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the problem itself, why this all kicked off. Then we'll get into 3 massive ideas you absolutely need to know. After that, we'll meet the philosophers who came up with them, and we'll finish up by weighing the arguments. And that's your key AO2 stuff right there.
Right, part 1. We need to understand the background here. The 20th century saw this incredible explosion of science, and that created a huge new challenge for religion. This is all about a massive clash that was brewing, science versus religion. So just picture this. Science is all about what you can observe, what you can test, what you can measure. But then you've got a statement like, God is love. How on earth do you put that in a test tube? You can't. So a new wave of philosophers, totally inspired by science, came along and said, look, if you can't test a statement with your senses, it's not just wrong, it is literally meaningless. It just sounds.
Okay, so with that massive challenge on the table, how did philosophy even begin to respond? Well, it turns out there were 3 big ideas that you absolutely have to know for your exam. Let's get into them. First up, we've got a group called the logical positivists. They came up with something called the verification principle, and it's pretty simple, really. They said a statement only has meaning if it's one of 2 things. It's either analytic, which is just a fancy way of saying it's true by definition, like a triangle has 3 sides, or it's synthetic, meaning you can actually check it with your senses, like the sky is blue. If it's not one of those 2, poof, it's meaningless. And guess what category all talk about God fell into? Yep, for them, it was just nonsense. Now, this idea didn't stay still. The first version, what we call strong verification, was super strict. You basically had to be able to verify it yourself right then and there. But a philosopher named A.J. Ayer came along and said, hang on, that's way too tough. So he came up with weak verification. He argued that a statement is meaningful as long as we know, in principle, what kind of evidence would prove it true, even if we can't get that evidence right now. The classic example he used was, there are mountains on the far side of the moon. Long before we could actually go and check, it was a meaningful claim because we knew how we would check if we could get there.
Okay, our second big idea basically flips the whole thing on its head. A guy named Karl Popper comes along and says, you're all looking at this the wrong way. He argued that what makes a statement properly scientific isn't that you can prove it's true, but that you could, potentially, prove it's false. Think about it. If I say all swans are white, that's a scientific claim because all you need to do to destroy my theory is find one single black swan. But if you make a claim where no evidence could ever possibly prove it wrong, Popper says that's not a real, factual claim. And that right there is the falsification principle.
And now for our third idea, which is a total curveball. This comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he just threw the whole rule book out. He said, look, the big mistake you're all making is thinking that all language has to work like science. He said, no way. For Wittgenstein, language is more like a collection of different games. Think of it like chess and football. They both have rules, but you can't use the rules of chess to make sense of football, right? He said religion is its own language game. So a phrase like God is good has perfect meaning inside the game of religion, even if it sounds like nonsense to someone playing the science game.
All right, so to really get our heads around these ideas, we need to see them clash. And the perfect way to do that is through a famous debate, sometimes called the Falsification Symposium. It's basically a 3-way showdown between our key thinkers, Antony Flew, R.M. Hare, and Basil Mitchell.
So, stepping into the ring first is Antony Flew. He takes Popper's falsification principle and aims it straight at religious belief. And to make his point crystal clear, he tells a little story, a parable. Okay, so the story goes like this. 2 explorers stumble upon a clearing in the jungle. It's beautiful, full of flowers, and one of them says, wow, a gardener must look after this place. But they wait and no one ever shows up. So they set up electric fences, patrol with dogs, nothing. But the believer doesn't give up. He just says, well, he must be an invisible gardener. Then, and he's silent, and you can't touch him. And this is where the skeptic hits him with the killer question. So what's the difference between an invisible, silent, intangible gardener and no gardener at all?
And that's Flu's big point. He's saying religious believers do this all the time with God, qualifying their claims until the original statement dies the death of 1,000 qualifications and just doesn't mean anything anymore.
In response to this, R.M. Hare basically says, Flu, you've completely missed the point. He argues that religious statements aren't supposed to be scientific facts that you can test. There's something totally different, something he calls a blick. So what on earth is a blick?
Well, Hodder tells his own story to explain. Imagine a student who is absolutely convinced that all his professors are trying to murder him. His friends try to help. They introduce him to the kindest professor they know. But the student's reaction is, see, he's just being cunning to trick me. You see, no amount of evidence is ever going to change his mind. That deep-seated, unfalsifiable conviction, that's his blick. Hodder argues that religious faith is like that. It's a framework for seeing the world that shapes your life, not a factual claim. So trying to falsify it is just, well, asking the wrong question.
And finally, Basil Mitchell steps in and tries to find a middle path. He looks at Flu and says, I agree with you. Religious claims are saying something about the real world. But then he looks at Hare and says, but it's not just a blind blick either. For Mitchell, faith is all about a commitment built on trust.
Mitchell's story is about a resistance fighter during a war. He meets a stranger who impresses him and claims to be the leader of the resistance. The partisan trusts him, but then things get complicated. Sometimes he sees the stranger helping his side, but other times he sees him wearing the enemy uniform, seemingly collaborating. Now, the partisan doesn't just ignore this. It worries him. It causes him real doubt. But because of that initial, powerful commitment of trust, he doesn't give up his belief. And that's Mitchell's big takeaway. He says believers do see things like suffering that count against their faith, but this evidence doesn't automatically falsify it because their faith is built on a foundation of trust.
All right, deep breath. This next bit is where you get the big marks in the exam, the AO2, the evaluation. We're going to break down the strengths and weaknesses of each of these ideas, kicking things off with the verification principle.
So, on the one hand, verificationism seems really strong. It's logical, it's scientific, but the weaknesses are pretty huge. For starters, and this is maybe the biggest own goal in philosophy, the principle itself, that a statement is only meaningful if you can check it with your senses, well, you can't check that with your senses. It fails its own test. It also basically throws huge parts of life, like art, ethics, and history, into the meaningless bin. And then you have thinkers like John Hick, who hit back with a really clever idea called eschatological verification. He basically said, religious claims can be verified. In principle, we just have to wait until after we die to do it.
So what about Wittgenstein's language games? Well, the big plus is that it allows religious language to have meaning on its own terms, shielding it from scientific attacks. But the major weakness is that it can create these little bubbles, these silos. If religion and science are just different games with totally different rules, how can they ever have a meaningful conversation? Critics also say it leads to a world where any belief system, no matter how weird, can just say, well, it's meaningful in my game.
And finally, let's evaluate that three-way debate. Flu's great strength is that he really nails a problem. Believers' claims can often seem to wriggle out of any challenge. His weakness, as Hare points out, is that he's judging religion by the rules of science, which might be the wrong tool for the job. Now, Mitchell's strength is that his parable just feels very true to the experience of having faith while also having doubts. The weakness, though, is that even if you hold a belief in a reasonable, trusting way, that doesn't actually prove the belief itself is true.
Ultimately, this entire debate really boils down to one crucial distinction. Are religious statements cognitive? That is, are they making factual claims about the world that can be proven true or false? The logical positivists and Flu definitely thought so. Or are they non-cognitive, not making factual claims at all, but instead expressing emotions, values, or a way of seeing the world? This is the view of Wittgenstein and Hare. Deciding where you stand on this is the key to your own evaluation.
And so we're left with the central question, the kind of thing you'll get in your essay. Which approach makes the most sense? Does religious language try and fail to be factual like science? Or is it doing something else entirely, expressing a unique form of human belief and commitment? There's no easy answer here, but now you have all the philosophical tools you need to build a powerful argument of your own. Good luck with your revision.